Hello, friends. Welcome to our channel, History Chronicles. In the grand halls of Versailles, beneath glittering chandeliers and surrounded by opulent gardens, there was a man who believed himself to be the very embodiment of France. This man was Louis XIV, the Sun King, who ruled over France for an astonishing 72 years. His reign was one of absolute power, where his word was law, and his desires shaped the destiny of an entire nation. But as we delve into the world of Louis XIV, we must not only admire the grandeur of his reign, but also recognize the shadows it cast over the future. The seeds of the French Revolution, a cataclysmic event that would forever change the course of history, were sown during the reign of this powerful monarch. Louis XIV ascended the throne at a young age, and from the very beginning, he was determined to assert his authority. "L'État, c'est moi," he famously declared. "I am the state." And indeed, Louis XIV lived as though France existed solely for his glory. He centralized power in the monarchy, diminishing the influence of the nobility and ensuring that all decisions flowed from him. The king's court at Versailles became the center of political power in France. Nobles who once held regional power were brought to Versailles, where they became dependent on the king for their wealth and status. They were kept busy with courtly rituals and ceremonies, leaving Louis XIV free to govern as he saw fit. Yet this concentration of power came at a cost. The construction and maintenance of Versailles were staggering expenses that drained the royal coffers. Wars, too, were a significant burden on the economy. Louis XIV's ambitions led to numerous conflicts, including the War of Spanish Succession, which further strained France's finances. The king's need for glory and expansion came at the expense of the common people, who were increasingly burdened with taxes to fund his endeavors. Despite these challenges, Louis XIV's reign was marked by a flourishing of the arts and culture. He was a patron of the arts, and under his rule, France became a cultural capital of Europe. The grandeur of the Baroque period was epitomized in the architecture of Versailles, the compositions of Lully, and the plays of Molière. The Sun King's court was a dazzling display of wealth and refinement, setting trends that were emulated across Europe. But beneath this glittering surface, discontent was brewing. The common people, the peasants who worked the land and the burgeoning middle class in the cities, were growing increasingly resentful of the heavy taxes and the king's extravagant lifestyle. They saw a widening gap between the lavish life of the court and their own struggles to survive. Moreover, the centralized power that Louis XIV established left little room for dissent. The Estates General, France's traditional representative assembly, was not convened during his reign, effectively silencing any voices that might challenge the king's authority. This lack of representation would become a significant grievance for future generations. As the 17th century drew to a close, the legacy of Louis XIV was one of grandeur, but also of growing unrest. His reign had set the stage for the conditions that would lead to the French Revolution. The centralized power, the economic strain, and the social divisions that he exacerbated would all play a role in the events that were to come. But for now, as the Sun King aged and his reign came to an end, France was left with a powerful monarchy, a weakened nobility, and a populace that was increasingly burdened and dissatisfied. The stage was set for the next chapter in France's history, a chapter that would be marked by turmoil, revolution, and the eventual downfall of the monarchy that Louis XIV had worked so hard to strengthen. And so, the story of the French Revolution begins not in the streets of Paris, but in the gilded halls of Versailles, with a king who believed himself to be the very heart of France. The seeds of discontent had been sown, and it was only a matter of time before they would grow into a movement that would shake the very foundations of the nation. In the next episode, we will explore how the economic and social divisions that were deepened during Louis XIV's reign began to unravel, setting the stage for a revolution that would change France and the world forever. Stay tuned as we continue this journey through one of the most pivotal periods in history. Thank you for joining us on History Chronicles. See you in the next episode. Hello, friends. Welcome to our channel History Chronicles. As the reign of Louis XIV came to an end, the grandeur of the French monarchy remained intact. But beneath the surface, the kingdom was facing a growing storm of discontent. The centralized power and extravagant lifestyle of the monarchy had left deep scars on the French society, setting the stage for a revolution that was still decades away. In this episode, we delve into the social and economic divisions that would soon push France to the brink of chaos. France in the late 17th and early 18th centuries was a land of stark contrasts. On one side, the nobility and the clergy lived lives of privilege and luxury, enjoying vast estates, tax exemptions, and influence over the monarchy. On the other, the common people, peasants, urban workers, and the emerging bourgeoisie struggled under the weight of taxes, poverty, and an increasingly rigid social hierarchy. The French society was divided into three estates. The first estate consisted of the clergy, who, despite being a small percentage of the population, wielded enormous power. They owned about 10% of the land in France and were exempt from most taxes. The church collected tithes from the people and had significant influence over education and moral guidance. Yet not all clergy lived in luxury. The higher clergy, bishops and abbots, enjoyed wealth and comfort, while the lower clergy, such as parish priests, often lived in conditions not much better than those of their parishioners. The second estate was the nobility. They owned about 25% of the land and, like the clergy, were largely exempt from taxes. The nobility held key positions in the government, military, and judiciary, and they had privileges that were out of reach for the rest of the population. However, the nobility itself was divided. The higher nobility, or nobles of the sword, were descendants of medieval knights and had long-standing titles. The lower nobility, or nobles of the robe, were often those who had purchased their titles or had risen to nobility through service to the king. Despite these internal divisions, the nobility was united in its desire to maintain its privileges and resist any changes that might threaten its status. The third estate, which made up about 98% of the population, included everyone else: peasants, urban workers, and the bourgeoisie. The peasants were the largest group within the third estate, and they bore the brunt of taxation. They paid the taille, a direct land tax, as well as numerous other feudal dues to their lords. In addition, they were required to provide labor on roads and other public works, known as the corvée, without any compensation. The burden of these obligations, combined with poor harvests and rising prices, led to widespread hardship among the peasantry. In the cities, the situation was no better. Urban workers, including artisans and laborers, faced low wages and rising costs of living. The rapid population growth in the cities, particularly Paris, led to overcrowding, unemployment, and poor living conditions. The urban poor were often at the mercy of economic fluctuations, and their discontent would later play a significant role in the revolutionary movement. Amidst this bleak landscape, the bourgeoisie, or the middle class, began to rise. The bourgeoisie was made up of merchants, lawyers, doctors, and other professionals who had become increasingly wealthy and influential. They resented the privileges of the nobility and the clergy and were frustrated by their exclusion from political power. Many in the bourgeoisie were educated and influenced by Enlightenment ideas, which championed reason, equality, and individual rights. They were eager for reform and would eventually become the leaders of the revolution. As the gap between the privileged classes and the third estate widened, so too did the sense of injustice. The monarchy's heavy taxation, coupled with the economic inequality and social divisions, created an environment ripe for unrest. The peasants were tired of their endless toil with little reward. The urban workers faced starvation and homelessness. The bourgeoisie, despite their wealth, were denied the political power they believed they deserved. By the time Louis XIV's successor, Louis XVI, took the throne, the financial situation in France had worsened. The wars of Louis XIV had drained the treasury, and the cost of maintaining the opulent court at Versailles continued to mount. Louis XIV's reign was marked by further financial mismanagement and increasing debt. The king's attempts at reform were met with resistance from the nobility and the clergy, who were unwilling to relinquish their privileges. The tension between the estates was not just about economics, it was also about power and identity. The nobility and clergy viewed themselves as the protectors of tradition and the rightful rulers of the land. They saw the Third Estate as subjects rather than citizens, people whose role was to support the higher estates rather than to participate in governance. This paternalistic attitude only deepened the resentment among the common people. In the countryside, peasants began to resist feudal obligations more openly. There were incidents of peasants refusing to pay taxes or to perform the corvée. In the cities, the bourgeoisie grew bolder in their demands for political representation and reform. Pamphlets and essays criticizing the monarchy and the privileges of the higher estates circulated widely, often in secret, as censorship laws were strict. As we look back on these social and economic divisions, it becomes clear that the French society was a powder keg waiting for a spark. The inequality, the burden of taxation, and the rigid class system created a society on the brink of revolution. The monarchy, the nobility, and the clergy were blind to the growing anger among the Third Estate, and this blindness would soon lead to their downfall. The roots of the French Revolution were planted deep within the social fabric of France. The discontent that had been growing for decades would soon erupt into a full-scale revolution that would sweep away the old order and forever change the course of history. In our next episode, we will delve into the economic crisis of 1788, where financial chaos would bring these tensions to a boiling point, setting the stage for the storm that was to come. Stay tuned as we continue our journey through the French Revolution. Thank you for joining us on History Chronicles. See you in the next episode. Hello, friends. Welcome to our channel, History Chronicles. By the late 18th century, France had become a nation teetering on the edge of financial collapse. The grandeur of the monarchy, once a symbol of French power and prestige, had become a burden too heavy to bear. The lavish spending, costly wars, and inefficient taxation system had drained the royal coffers, and now the kingdom was facing a crisis that threatened not just the economy, but the very foundation of society. In this episode, we'll explore how the economic crisis of 1788 became the breaking point for a nation already rife with tension, setting the stage for the French Revolution. The roots of the crisis can be traced back to the reign of Louis XIV, whose wars and extravagant spending had left France deeply in debt. Successive rulers, including Louis XV and now Louis XVI, inherited this financial mess. However, rather than addressing the systemic issues, the monarchy continued its spending spree, particularly on maintaining the opulent court at Versailles. Meanwhile, the tax system remained highly inefficient and deeply unfair. The burden of taxation fell disproportionately on the Third Estate, peasants, urban workers, and the bourgeoisie, while the First and Second Estates, consisting of the clergy and nobility, enjoyed exemptions from most taxes. This inequitable system led to a growing resentment among the Third Estate. As we discussed in our previous episode, the peasants were struggling under heavy tax burdens and feudal obligations. The urban workers faced rising costs and unemployment, and the bourgeoisie, despite their wealth, were denied political power. The frustration among these groups was reaching a boiling point. In 1786, the financial situation became critical. The government, unable to meet its obligations, faced a staggering budget deficit. France was effectively bankrupt, with its debt exceeding 4 billion livres, a colossal sum for the time. The problem was compounded by the fact that the government's income was insufficient to cover even the interest payments on its debt, let alone its regular expenses. The dire financial situation was exacerbated by a series of poor harvests, leading to food shortages and rising bread prices. The people were hungry, and hunger has always been a powerful catalyst for social unrest. Louis XVI and his advisors, including the finance minister Charles Alexandre de Calonne, recognized the need for drastic reforms. Calonne proposed a series of measures to address the financial crisis, including the introduction of a more equitable tax system, reducing government expenditures, and stimulating economic growth through infrastructure projects. However, these reforms required the approval of the nobility and the clergy, who were reluctant to give up their privileges. To gain support for his reforms, Calonne persuaded Louis XVI to convene the Assembly of Notables in 1787. This assembly was composed of hand-picked members of the nobility, clergy, and other influential figures. Calonne hoped that the notables would support his proposals, but instead, they rejected them outright. The assembly insisted that any new taxes must be approved by the Estates General, the traditional representative assembly that had not been convened since 1614. The Estates General included representatives from all three estates, and its reassembly would open the door to demands for broader political reform. Facing the collapse of his financial plan and mounting pressure, Calonne was dismissed, and his successor, Étienne Charles de Loménie de Brienne, attempted to push through similar reforms. However, Brienne encountered the same resistance from the nobility and clergy. The situation deteriorated further when the Parliament of Paris, the judicial body that registered royal edicts, refused to approve new taxes, arguing that only the Estates General had the authority to do so. As the financial crisis deepened, the government was forced to take desperate measures. By 1788, France was in a state of financial and social turmoil. The treasury was empty, and the government could no longer borrow money. Creditors were losing confidence in the monarchy's ability to repay its debts, and inflation was rampant. The price of bread, the staple food of the French people, skyrocketed, leading to widespread hunger and unrest. Bread riots broke out in several cities as desperate people looted bakeries and demanded relief from the government. In the countryside, the situation was equally dire. Poor harvests in 1787 and 1788 led to famine in many regions. Peasants, already burdened by taxes and feudal dues, were now facing starvation. Their anger and frustration grew, and they began to resist their feudal obligations more openly. The tension between the peasants and their feudal lords was escalating, and violence was becoming increasingly common. Amidst this chaos, Louis XVI made a fateful decision. In July 1788, he agreed to convene the Estates General for the following year. This decision was seen as an admission that the monarchy could no longer govern without the consent of the people. It was a momentous step, one that would unleash forces beyond the king's control. The convening of the Estates General was a historic event, one that the people of France greeted with a mixture of hope and apprehension. For the first time in over a century, the representatives of all three estates would gather to address the kingdom's most pressing issues. However, the divisions between the estates were deep, and it was unclear whether they could come together to solve the crisis or whether their differences would only deepen the nation's woes. As the year 1788 drew to a close, France was on the brink of revolution. The economic crisis had laid bare the deep divisions within society, and the old order was crumbling under the weight of its own contradictions. The monarchy, once the unchallenged center of power, was now seen as weak and ineffective. The people were hungry, angry, and desperate for change. And so, the stage was set for the dramatic events of 1789, when the Estates General would meet and the French Revolution would begin in earnest. But before we reach that point, we must first understand the growing unrest among the people, especially the peasants, who were the backbone of the Third Estate. In our next episode, we will delve into the subsistence crisis that gripped France in the years leading up to the Revolution. We will explore how hunger and despair fueled the anger of the common people, pushing them to demand radical change. Stay tuned as we continue our journey through the French Revolution. Thank you for joining us on History Chronicles. See you in the next episode. Hello friends, welcome to our channel History Chronicles. The sun rises over the French countryside, casting a golden light over the fields. But this beauty is deceptive. Beneath the calm facade, a storm is brewing, a storm of hunger, anger, and despair. The peasants who till these fields are facing a reality that no amount of sunlight can brighten. There is no food. The grain they rely on for survival has dwindled to almost nothing, and what little remains is priced beyond their reach. The year is 1788, and France is on the brink of a revolution, one fueled not just by ideas, but by empty stomachs. Imagine waking up every day with the gnawing ache of hunger. For months, you've watched as the crops you planted with such hope have withered away, destroyed by unrelenting cold and rain. You've seen your children cry themselves to sleep, their bellies empty, their eyes full of fear. You've sold whatever you could, the family cow, your last bit of land, just to buy a few scraps of bread, and now, even that is gone. This is the reality faced by millions of French peasants in the late 1780s, a reality that would soon ignite the fires of revolution. The crisis wasn't just a sudden event, it was the result of years of neglect and mismanagement by the ruling classes. The feudal system that dominated rural France was designed to benefit the nobles and the church at the expense of the peasantry. The taxes were heavy, the tithes were mandatory, and the corvée, unpaid or required by the lords, left the peasants with little time to tend to their own needs. Even in good years, life was a struggle. But in the late 1780s, it became unbearable. The winter of 1787 to 1788 was particularly harsh. A bitter cold gripped the land, freezing rivers and making travel nearly impossible. The fields, blanketed in snow, lay dormant. When spring finally arrived, it brought with it devastating floods that washed away what little hope the peasants had left. The summer that followed was no better. Drought parched the earth, leaving the crops stunted and the wells dry. The harvest that year was one of the worst in living memory. The grain stores, already depleted, ran dry. Bread, the staple of the French diet, became a luxury that few could afford. In the cities, the situation was equally dire. Bread riots erupted as desperate urban workers, unable to feed their families, took to the streets. The cries of "bread, bread" echoed through the narrow alleys of Paris, Lyon, and other major cities. Women, who bore the brunt of the hardship as they struggled to provide for their children, were often at the forefront of these protests. They stormed bakeries, demanding that prices be lowered and hoarded grain be released. The authorities, unable to quell the unrest, responded with force, but this only fueled the anger of the people. As the crisis deepened, rumors began to spread like wildfire. Whispers of grain hoarding by the nobles and the clergy circulated through the villages and towns. It was said that the aristocrats were deliberately withholding grain to drive up prices and starve the poor into submission. Whether these rumors were true or not mattered little. They fed into the growing resentment against the ruling classes. The people, already pushed to the brink, were now convinced that they were being deliberately starved. The king, Louis XVI, was seen as indifferent, even callous, to the suffering of his people. He continued to live in luxury at Versailles, seemingly oblivious to the misery that plagued the nation. When news of the bread riots reached the royal court, the response was one of disbelief and disdain. How could the people be so ungrateful, so unruly? The king's ministers, desperate to maintain order, urged him to take a stronger stance, to crush the uprisings before they spread further. But Louis XVI, indecisive and weak, hesitated. His failure to act decisively only emboldened the revolutionaries. It wasn't just the peasants and urban workers who were suffering. The middle class, or bourgeoisie, who had once enjoyed relative prosperity, were also feeling the pinch. Many had invested heavily in land, hoping to profit from the agricultural economy. But now, with the collapse of the harvests and the skyrocketing price of bread, their investments were worthless. Their anger at the feudal system, which prevented them from achieving true wealth and power, grew. They began to see themselves as the natural leaders of a movement to overthrow the old order and replace it with something new, something more just and equitable. One story that spread across France during this time was that of a small village in the countryside. The villagers, facing starvation, had reached out to their local lord for help, but instead of providing them with the grain they so desperately needed, the lord had locked his stores and increased the price of bread. Enraged, the villagers gathered in the square, their faces gaunt with hunger, but their eyes blazing with determination. They marched to the lord's manor, demanding that he open his granaries. When he refused, the villagers took matters into their own hands. They broke down the doors, seized the grain, and distributed it among themselves. The lord, terrified and powerless, fled the village, leaving his once loyal subjects to fend for themselves. This story, whether true or not, became a symbol of the growing defiance among the common people. It showed that they were no longer willing to accept their fate quietly. They were ready to fight for their survival, even if it meant challenging the very foundations of society. By the time 1789 dawned, the subsistence crisis had reached a tipping point. The people of France, driven to desperation by hunger and poverty, were no longer content to live under a system that exploited them. They demanded change, and they were willing to fight for it. The stage was set for the events that would soon follow: the calling of the Estates General, the formation of the National Assembly, and the storming of the Bastille. But before we dive into those momentous events, it's important to understand how the ideas of the Enlightenment, which had been simmering in the background, began to fuse with the anger and desperation of the common people. In our next episode, we'll explore how the philosophies of thinkers like Rousseau, Voltaire, and Montesquieu provided the intellectual fuel for the revolution. We'll see how these ideas spread among the people, giving them not just the will, but the justification to rise up against their oppressors. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the history of the French Revolution. Stay tuned for the next episode of History Chronicles. See you next time. Hello friends, welcome to our channel History Chronicles. In the late 18th century, France was a nation on the brink of revolution, and at the heart of the unrest was one of the most basic human needs: bread. For centuries, bread had been the staple of the French diet, especially for the working poor. Yet, as the 1780s wore on, the price of this essential food began to soar, leading to widespread discontent that would contribute to the revolutionary fervor sweeping the nation. The French economy was in dire straits, burdened by debt from costly wars and an inefficient tax system that placed a heavy burden on the common people. Compounding these issues was a series of poor harvests, which led to grain shortages and drove up the price of bread to unprecedented levels. In Paris and other urban centers, where the majority of the population relied on bread as their primary source of sustenance, this was nothing short of a crisis. By 1788 and 1789, bread prices had reached such heights that many could no longer afford to feed their families. The situation was exacerbated by rumors that grain was being hoarded by speculators and that the government was indifferent to the plight of the poor. For the people of France, this was not just an economic problem. It was a matter of survival. The anger and frustration of the people soon boiled over into action. Bread riots began to erupt across the country, with hungry crowds storming bakeries, markets, and granaries in search of food. In some cases, the rioters would seize grain shipments or force bakers to sell their bread at what they deemed a just price. These riots were often spontaneous and driven by the desperation of those involved. But they also reflected a deep-seated belief that the government and the wealthy were failing in their moral duty to ensure that everyone had enough to eat. In Paris, the bread riots took on a particularly intense character. The capital was home to a large and restive population, many of whom were unemployed or underemployed. As bread prices continued to rise, the city's markets became flashpoints for unrest. Women, who were often the ones responsible for buying food for their families, played a prominent role in these riots. They would lead the charge to bakeries and marketplaces, demanding that bakers lower their prices or that officials release hoarded grain. The bread riots were not just about food. They were also about power and justice. The people of France, especially the poor, saw the price of bread as a symbol of the broader inequities in their society. They believed that the aristocracy and the government were more concerned with their own wealth and privileges than with the welfare of the people. By taking to the streets and demanding bread at a fair price, the rioters were also demanding a more just and equitable society. One of the most significant bread riots occurred in the spring of 1789, just months before the fall of the Bastille. In April, a rumor spread through Paris that a wealthy factory owner, Varennes, had suggested lowering wages to offset the high cost of bread. Enraged by this perceived insult, a mob descended on Varennes' home and factory, looting and destroying property in a violent outburst that left several people dead. This riot, known as the Varennes riots, was one of the first major episodes of violence in the revolutionary period and served as a precursor to the more widespread unrest that would soon engulf the country. As the bread riots continued to spread, they began to take on a more organized and political character. The people of France were no longer just demanding bread. They were demanding change. The grievances that had been simmering for years over taxes, feudal obligations, and the concentration of power in the hands of the few were now being voiced in the streets. The bread riots were a clear sign that the social contract between the rulers and the ruled had broken down, and that the people were ready to take matters into their own hands. The bread riots of 1789 were a critical moment in the lead-up to the French Revolution. They highlighted the desperation and anger of the French people, and they showed the ruling elite that the status quo could no longer be maintained. While these riots were often chaotic and violent, they were also deeply symbolic. They were a manifestation of the people's demand for justice, for fairness, and for the basic necessities of life. As the revolution progressed, the issue of bread would remain a central concern. Even as the National Assembly debated the future of the nation, the people in the streets were still struggling to put food on the table. The cry for bread, liberty, and equality became a rallying point for revolutionaries, and it was a reminder that the revolution was not just about political change, but about ensuring that every citizen had the means to live with dignity. Thank you for joining us today on History Chronicles. The bread riots were more than just a reaction to hunger. They were a powerful expression of the people's demand for a better life. As we continue to explore the events of the French Revolution, we'll see how this demand would shape the course of history and lead to the radical changes that transformed France. Until next time, stay curious and keep exploring with History Chronicles. Hello, friends. Welcome to our channel History Chronicles. In the heart of France, as the ideas of the Enlightenment spread like wildfire, another force was beginning to stir, one that would play a crucial role in shaping the course of the French Revolution. This force was the growing middle class, the bourgeoisie, whose influence and power were steadily rising, yet who remained shackled by the rigid social hierarchy of the Ancien Regime. The bourgeoisie were a diverse group. They ranged from wealthy merchants and bankers to lawyers, doctors, and even successful shopkeepers. Unlike the nobility, who inherited their wealth and status, the bourgeoisie had earned theirs through hard work, intelligence, and a keen sense of business. They were educated, well-read, and increasingly aware of the injustices around them. Imagine being one of them, a prosperous merchant in a bustling city like Bordeaux. You've worked hard to build your business, navigating the complex web of trade and commerce, dealing with suppliers from distant lands, and selling your goods to the eager townspeople. Yet, despite your success, you find yourself constantly thwarted by the privileges of the nobility. The nobility, who own vast estates and collect taxes from the peasants working on their land, enjoy privileges that you, despite your wealth, are denied. They are exempt from many taxes, have exclusive rights to certain offices, and wield significant influence over the king's decisions. You, on the other hand, despite your education and contributions to the economy, are treated as a second-class citizen. These privileges are not just annoying, they are stifling. They limit your ability to grow your business, to invest in new ventures, and to pass on your hard-earned wealth to your children without it being heavily taxed. You see the nobility, many of whom have done nothing to earn their wealth, living lives of luxury while you are forced to fight for every franc. And it's not just you. Across France, the bourgeoisie are beginning to see these privileges as an affront to justice and equality. They are increasingly frustrated by the fact that their talents and efforts are not rewarded with the same respect and opportunities as those of the nobility. The writings of philosophers like Voltaire and Montesquieu resonate deeply with them, reinforcing their belief that a society should be based on merit, not birthright. But there is more at stake here than just personal grievances. The bourgeoisie are not just fighting for themselves, they are fighting for a new vision of society. They believe in the ideas of liberty, equality, and fraternity. They want a society where everyone has the opportunity to succeed, where power is based on talent and effort, not on the accident of birth. They want a society where laws are fair, where taxes are distributed equitably, and where everyone, regardless of their social class, has a voice in how the country is governed. As the economic crisis deepens and the price of bread continues to rise, the bourgeoisie find themselves increasingly aligned with the lower classes. They may not share the same hardships as the peasants or the urban poor, but they recognize that their struggles are connected. The privileges of the nobility are a burden on everyone, and the only way to remove them is to unite in the fight for a more just society. One story that captures the spirit of this growing movement is that of a young lawyer named Jacques. Jacques came from a modest background, but through hard work and dedication, he managed to earn a degree in law. He set up a small practice in Paris, representing the interests of the common people. But he quickly became disillusioned with the legal system, which was heavily biased in favor of the nobility. Jacques would often represent clients who were being unfairly taxed or who had been evicted from their land by a nobleman. He saw firsthand how the privileges of the nobility were crushing the hopes and dreams of ordinary people. Determined to fight back, Jacques began to organize meetings with other like-minded lawyers, merchants, and intellectuals. They would gather in secret, discussing ways to challenge the system, to demand reforms, and to push for a more equitable society. These meetings were the seeds of what would eventually grow into a powerful movement. The bourgeoisie, armed with the ideas of the Enlightenment and motivated by their own experiences of injustice, began to demand change. They used their influence, their wealth, and their education to challenge the status quo. They wrote pamphlets, organized protests, and lobbied the king for reforms. Their efforts culminated in the calling of the Estates General in 1789, where representatives of the Third Estate, including many from the bourgeoisie, would confront the king and the nobility directly. It was here that the struggle for equality would reach a turning point, as the Third Estate declared themselves the National Assembly, refusing to be silenced or sidelined any longer. The fight of the bourgeoisie was not just about ending privileges. It was about redefining what it meant to be a citizen of France. It was about creating a society where merit was rewarded, where everyone had the opportunity to succeed, and where the laws applied equally to all. This fight would soon become the heart of the French Revolution, as the bourgeoisie, alongside the peasants and the urban poor, rose up to demand a new order. In our next episode, we will witness a crucial moment in this struggle, the calling of the Estates General and the historic tennis court oath, where the representatives of the Third Estate took a bold stand against the king and the nobility, setting the stage for the revolution to come. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the history of the French Revolution. Stay tuned for the next episode of History Chronicles. See you next time. Hello, friends. Welcome to our channel, History Chronicles. The winds of change were blowing through France, not just in the form of hunger and poverty, but also in the shape of new ideas, ideas that challenged everything that had been accepted for centuries. As the subsistence crisis pushed the people to their limits, something else was simmering beneath the surface, something powerful enough to light the fuse of revolution. These were the ideas of the Enlightenment, philosophies that questioned the divine right of kings, the privileges of the nobility, and the inequality that had long been entrenched in French society. Imagine sitting in a small, dimly lit room in Paris, surrounded by books and pamphlets. You're a young lawyer, or perhaps a shopkeeper, with a thirst for knowledge and a growing sense of injustice about the world around you. You've just finished reading the works of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who argues that all men are born free and equal, that the government should be a social contract between the rulers and the ruled, not a divine mandate handed down by God. His words resonate deeply with you, challenging everything you've been taught to believe. Rousseau's ideas were radical. He questioned the very foundation of the monarchy, suggesting that power should not come from the top down, but from the people themselves. He spoke of the general will, the collective will of the citizens, which should guide the state. If the government failed to serve the people, he argued, it was not just the right, but the duty of the people to overthrow it. But Rousseau was not the only voice stirring the pot. Voltaire, with his sharp wit and biting criticism, attacked the church and the state with equal fervor. He championed freedom of speech, religious tolerance, and the separation of church and state. Voltaire's famous line, "I disapprove of what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it," became a rallying cry for those who sought to challenge the old order. And then there was Montesquieu, whose work, The Spirit of the Laws, introduced the idea of the separation of powers, an idea that would later become a cornerstone of modern democratic governments. Montesquieu argued that to prevent tyranny, power should be divided among different branches of government, executive, legislative, and judicial, each acting as a check on the others. These ideas were not just confined to the salons of Paris or the libraries of the educated elite. They spread like wildfire, reaching even the most remote villages. Pamphlets and books were smuggled in, passed from hand to hand, read aloud in taverns and marketplaces. The printing press, a relatively new invention, played a crucial role in disseminating these revolutionary ideas. What had once been the domain of scholars and philosophers was now becoming common knowledge among the people. The Enlightenment thinkers challenged the status quo in ways that had never been done before. They questioned why a few should live in opulence while the masses suffered in poverty. They asked why one man should be king by birthright while another toiled in the fields, hungry and oppressed. They exposed the hypocrisy of the church, which preached charity and humility, but lived in wealth and power. In the eyes of the common people, these ideas provided a new way of looking at the world. No longer were they willing to accept their suffering as the will of God or their place in the world as unchangeable. They began to see themselves not as subjects, but as citizens, with rights, with a voice, with the power to change their fate. One story that illustrates the power of these ideas involves a group of workers in a small town in southern France. These men had spent their entire lives laboring in the fields, barely scraping by. But one day, they heard a traveling merchant read from a pamphlet by Voltaire. The words struck a chord with them. They began to meet secretly, discussing these new ideas, questioning why they should be subject to the whims of a distant king who cared nothing for their lives. They started to believe that perhaps they too had the right to a better life, to freedom, to equality. These discussions were not without risk. The authorities were well aware of the danger these ideas posed to the established order. Censorship was rampant, and those caught spreading seditious material could face imprisonment or worse. But the ideas were too powerful to be silenced. The more the authorities tried to suppress them, the more they spread. The people, once passive and resigned, were now filled with a new sense of purpose, a new vision of what their world could be. By the time the Estates General was called in 1789, these ideas had taken deep root in the minds of the French people. They were no longer willing to accept their lot in life. They wanted change. The Enlightenment had given them the tools to think critically, to question authority, and to demand their rights. These ideas would soon translate into action as the people rose up to challenge the old order and create a new one in its place. In our next episode, we'll see how this growing discontent led to a pivotal moment in French history, the tennis court oath. We'll explore how the representatives of the Third Estate, inspired by the ideas of the Enlightenment, took a bold stand against the king and the nobility, setting the stage for the revolution to come. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the history of the French Revolution. Stay tuned for the next episode of History Chronicles. See you next time. Hello, friends. Welcome to our channel, History Chronicles. In the summer of 1789, France was on the brink of profound change. The air was thick with anticipation and uncertainty as the Estates General convened for the first time in over a century. This was not just a political assembly. It was a stage set for a showdown between the old regime and a new order waiting to be born. Louis XVI, the King of France faced a kingdom in crisis. The economy was in shambles, the people were restless, and the nobility's privileges were being increasingly questioned. To address these issues, Louis XVI had summoned the Estates General, a traditional assembly representing the three estates: the clergy, the nobility, and the common people. Imagine being one of the delegates representing the third estate. You are a member of the bourgeoisie, or a local notary, having traveled from your village to the grand halls of Versailles. The grandeur of the palace contrasts sharply with the dire conditions you've left behind. The common people are suffering, and you're here to demand change. As you take your seat among the other delegates, you're acutely aware of the gravity of the moment. The Estates General is meant to be a forum for addressing grievances and proposing reforms. However, from the outset, it's clear that the process is deeply flawed. The first estate, clergy, and the second estate, nobility, hold considerable power and are unlikely to support substantial changes that would undermine their own privileges. Louis XVI's approach is cautious. He hopes that by convening the Estates General, he might appease the growing unrest without making significant concessions. But the delegates of the Third Estate, representing the common people, are not here merely to play a role in a show. They have come with a clear mandate: to push for reforms that reflect the needs and aspirations of the majority. Tensions quickly rise as the delegates debate how the assembly should proceed. The Third Estate demands that all votes be conducted by head, not by estate. This would allow their greater numbers to have a real impact on decisions. The clergy and nobility resist, preferring to keep the voting system that favors their own interests. Amidst this standoff, an extraordinary event occurs: the tennis court oath. On June 20th, 1789, after being locked out of their meeting hall, the representatives of the Third Estate gather in a nearby indoor tennis court. Here, they take a historic oath, pledging not to disband until they have drafted a new constitution for France. Imagine the scene: a group of determined men standing together in a cramped, echoing space, their voices filled with resolve. They vow to fight for a constitution that will represent the will of the people and reshape the governance of France. This act of defiance marks a dramatic shift from seeking reform to actively pursuing revolutionary change. The tennis court oath is more than just a symbolic gesture. It's a declaration of the Third Estate's intent to challenge the status quo. It embodies their belief that true change requires more than just dialogue. It requires action. This pivotal moment sets the stage for the dramatic events that will follow. As word of the tennis court oath spreads, it galvanizes support among the common people. The streets of Paris buzz with news of the delegates' commitment to a new France. The old regime, unprepared for such determined resistance, begins to feel the pressure. In the coming days, the Third Estate will formally declare itself the National Assembly, asserting its authority and beginning the process of drafting a new constitution. This act of political boldness will lead to further confrontations with the king and the other estates, as well as the eventual storming of the Bastille, a key moment in the unfolding revolution. In our next episode, we will delve into this defining event, exploring how the storming of the Bastille became a powerful symbol of the revolution and a catalyst for further change. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the French Revolution. Stay tuned for the next episode of History Chronicles. See you next time. Hello, friends. Welcome to our channel History Chronicles. On July 14th, 1789, a monumental event unfolded in Paris that would forever alter the course of French history. This was the day the Bastille, a fortress and prison, was stormed by an enraged populace. The storming of the Bastille was not merely a military action. It was a powerful symbol of the people's uprising against tyranny and the dawn of a new era. Let's step back and imagine the scene in Paris leading up to this crucial day. The city is teeming with unrest. The economic crisis is dire. Bread prices have soared, and the common people are struggling to feed their families. The resentment against the monarchy and the nobility is reaching a boiling point. The Estates General, convened earlier in May, has failed to provide the relief that the people desperately need. The king's indecision and the rigid resistance from the privileged estates have only heightened the sense of urgency among the common folk. Amidst this backdrop of tension and desperation, the Bastille stands as a symbol of oppressive authority. Originally built as a fortress to defend Paris, the Bastille had evolved into a state prison used by the kings of France to detain political prisoners without trial. Its massive stone walls and imposing towers had come to represent the unchecked power of the monarchy and the repression of dissent. The storming of the Bastille was not a spontaneous event, but the culmination of rising frustration and calculated planning. As rumors spread that the king might use military force against the revolutionaries, the people of Paris decided to act. They feared that the king's troops, stationed around the city, would soon be unleashed to crush the burgeoning rebellion. On the morning of July 14th, crowds began to gather outside the Bastille, their anger palpable. They were armed with makeshift weapons, scythes, pikes, and even farming tools. Many were ordinary citizens, artisans, laborers, and merchants who had grown weary of the king's oppressive regime. They were driven by a profound sense of injustice and a determination to secure their future. The situation quickly escalated. The Bastille's governor, Bernard-René de Launay, was aware of the brewing storm, but underestimated the resolve of the crowd. The fortress was heavily fortified, and its defenders were confident they could hold out. However, the growing number of insurgents and their determination to secure the fortress proved overwhelming. The initial approach was strategic. Revolutionary leaders sent representatives to negotiate with the governor. They sought to persuade him to surrender the fortress without a fight. The demands were straightforward: the release of the prisoners, the surrender of the fortress, and the transfer of arms and ammunition to the people. The governor, however, was steadfast, believing that the fortress could be defended and that yielding would undermine the king's authority. Negotiations quickly broke down, and the crowd's patience began to wear thin. The tension mounted as the mob's shouts and demands grew louder. The revolutionary forces, now fully committed, decided to escalate their actions. They laid siege to the fortress, using cannons and ladders to breach its defenses. The battle was chaotic, marked by intense skirmishes and fierce clashes. Inside the Bastille, the defenders faced a dire situation. The garrison, though brave, was vastly outnumbered. The fortress's defenses, designed to repel a formal siege, were ill-suited to withstand the sheer number and fervor of the attackers. The battle raged throughout the day, with both sides suffering casualties. The turning point came in the late afternoon. The crowd managed to breach the outer defenses, pushing their way into the courtyard. The fighting was fierce, but the people's determination proved too much for the defenders. In the end, the fortress was overtaken, and the governor was captured. The fall of the Bastille was a resounding victory for the revolutionaries. It was not just a military triumph, but a profound symbolic victory. The capture of the fortress and the weapons it held was a powerful statement against the tyranny of the old regime. The Bastille, once a symbol of royal oppression, had been transformed into a symbol of the people's power and their resolve to fight for their rights. As the news of the Bastille's fall spread, it ignited a wave of enthusiasm across France. The people celebrated their victory with fervor, viewing it as the dawn of a new era of liberty and justice. The fall of the Bastille became a rallying point for the revolution, uniting various factions of the populace in their quest for change. In the days following the storming of the Bastille, Paris and other cities across France witnessed a series of uprisings and reforms. The revolutionary spirit, once sparked by the fall of the fortress, began to spread. The people demanded further changes, and the old regime found itself increasingly unable to maintain control. The storming of the Bastille also had significant international repercussions. It was seen as a dramatic manifestation of the revolutionary fervor that was sweeping through France. The fall of the Bastille symbolized the collapse of the old order and the birth of a new, more egalitarian society. It also garnered attention and support from abroad, further isolating the French monarchy and rallying international sympathy for the revolutionary cause. In our next episode, we will delve into France's involvement in America's struggle for independence and explore how this influence shaped the French revolutionaries' vision for justice and freedom. we will examine how the American fight for liberty inspired the French to seek their own path to justice and equality. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the French Revolution. Stay tuned for the next episode of History Chronicles. See you next time. Hello, friends. Welcome to our channel, History Chronicles. In today's episode, we delve into a fascinating chapter of history, France's involvement in the American Revolution, and how it influenced the French people's own quest for justice and reform. This connection between two great revolutions reveals how the ideals of freedom and democracy traveled across the Atlantic, inspiring the French to envision a new future for themselves. As the American colonies grappled with British rule in the late 18th century, France found itself both a player in and a spectator of this dramatic struggle. The American Revolution, a fight for independence and self-governance, became a source of inspiration for many in France who were disillusioned with their own monarchy and social injustices. France's support for the American cause was driven by a complex mix of political, strategic, and ideological motivations. King Louis XVI, despite his own kingdom's financial troubles, saw an opportunity to weaken Britain, France's long-standing rival. By providing military and financial aid to the American colonies, France aimed to shift the balance of power and potentially gain a strategic advantage. The French government's involvement included supplying the Americans with crucial resources such as weapons, funds, and military expertise. One of the most significant contributions came through the efforts of French military officers like Marquis de Lafayette, who played a key role in the American struggle. Lafayette, a young French aristocrat, had been inspired by the American fight for liberty and sought to assist their cause. Imagine the scene. Lafayette, fresh from his own revolutionary fervor, arriving in America to join the fight. His enthusiasm and strategic acumen made a considerable impact, and his efforts were deeply appreciated by the American forces. Lafayette's involvement not only bolstered the American cause, but also brought the ideals of the Revolution back to France with him. French support for the American Revolution was not limited to individual efforts. The French government formally recognized the independence of the American colonies in 1778 and entered into a military alliance with them. This alliance included the provision of troops, naval support, and financial assistance. The French Navy, in particular, played a crucial role in key battles, such as the decisive victory at the Siege of Yorktown in 1781. The success of the American Revolution had profound implications for France. As news of the American victory and the establishment of a new democratic government spread, it stirred excitement and hope among the French populace. The principles of liberty, equality, and fraternity that had guided the American Revolution resonated deeply with those who had long struggled under the yoke of an autocratic monarchy. The French revolutionaries saw the American Revolution as a powerful example of how a determined people could overthrow an oppressive regime and create a society based on democratic principles. The American fight for freedom provided a tangible model for the French people, reinforcing their own aspirations for reform. This inspiration was evident in the revolutionary rhetoric that emerged in France. The ideals of the American Revolution, liberty, equality, and fraternity, became central to the French revolutionary cause. French revolutionaries, influenced by the American example, began to articulate their demands for political change with renewed vigor. In addition to ideological inspiration, the practical assistance provided by France during the American Revolution had its own repercussions. The financial burden of supporting the American cause contributed to France's already dire economic situation. The cost of the war exacerbated the financial crisis in France, creating further strains on the economy and intensifying public discontent. The economic strain, coupled with the revolutionary spirit kindled by the American example, set the stage for the events that would follow in France. As the French Revolution unfolded, the lessons and inspirations from the American struggle continued to shape the course of events. The revolutionaries, armed with the belief that they could also challenge and change their own system of governance, pressed forward with their demands for reform. In our next episode, we will explore how the economic crisis in France contributed to the growing discontent and revolutionary fervor. We'll examine the key factors that led to the breakdown of the old order and the emergence of a new political landscape. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the history of the French Revolution. Stay tuned for the next episode of History Chronicles. See you next time. Hello friends, welcome to our channel History Chronicles. In the tumultuous summer of 1789, as the flames of revolution spread across France, a dramatic and poignant chapter unfolded: the Women's March on Versailles. This episode not only highlights a crucial event, but also sheds light on the profound role women played in the revolution. Imagine the scene in Paris, October 5th, 1789. The city is restless. The economic crisis has reached a boiling point, and the price of bread has soared to unbearable levels. The streets are crowded with people struggling to feed their families, their frustration and desperation palpable. The common folk, especially the women who bear the brunt of poverty and hunger, are increasingly vocal about their grievances. Among them is a woman named Marie, a market vendor who has seen the price of bread rise from a few sous to an exorbitant sum. Each morning, she wakes before dawn to buy bread, only to find that her meager earnings can no longer stretch far enough. Her children are hungry, and her patience is wearing thin. Marie is not alone in her plight. Many women in Paris share her struggle. On this particular day, a spark ignites the simmering anger of these women. A rumor spreads that the king and queen, living in opulence at the Palace of Versailles, are indifferent to their suffering. The royal court is seen as a symbol of excess and detachment, a stark contrast to the harsh realities faced by the common people. Fueled by a mix of anger and desperation, a group of women decides to take action. Marie and hundreds of other women, armed with improvised weapons and driven by a sense of urgency, march toward Versailles. Their destination is not merely a protest, but a bold statement. They march through the streets of Paris, their voices rising in a chorus of demands for bread and justice. Their march is a demonstration of their resolve to be heard and to seek relief from their dire situation. The journey to Versailles is arduous. The women, despite their exhaustion and the threatening weather, press on. Their determination is unwavering. As they approach the opulent palace, the contrast between their ragged, weary appearance and the grandeur of Versailles is striking. The palace, with its golden facades and manicured gardens, seems to mock their suffering. Upon arriving at Versailles, the women's anger turns into a powerful collective voice. They storm the palace gates, demanding an audience with the king and queen. Their message is clear: the people of Paris are suffering, and it is time for the royal family to address their needs. The palace, once a symbol of unapproachable royalty, is now the focal point of a determined and resolute crowd. The scene inside the palace is tense. The royal family, shocked and disoriented by the sudden intrusion, faces the full force of the women's frustration. The queen, Marie Antoinette, is particularly targeted, with many of the women blaming her for their plight. The demands are straightforward: lower the price of bread and provide relief to those who are suffering. The march proves to be a pivotal moment. The sheer force and determination of the women cannot be ignored. Their actions force the royal family to make a critical decision. In an effort to quell the unrest and to acknowledge the gravity of the situation, Louis XVI agrees to meet the women's demands. He promises to provide bread and to make reforms that will alleviate some of the suffering. The resolution of the march, however, is far from the end of the struggle. The women, having achieved a partial victory, return to Paris with a mix of relief and continued determination. Their actions have not only secured immediate relief, but have also sent a clear message: the people are no longer willing to tolerate injustice and inequality. The Women's March on Versailles is a testament to the power of collective action. It underscores the role of women as active participants in the revolutionary movement, challenging the status quo and demanding change. Their march symbolizes a turning point, showing that the struggle for justice and equality is not confined to any single group, but is a shared endeavor across society. In our next episode, we will explore how France transformed from an absolute monarchy to a constitutional one in 1791, examining the challenges and changes that accompanied this significant shift. Thank you for joining us in this episode of History Chronicles. Stay tuned for the next chapter in our exploration of the French Revolution. See you next time. Hello, friends. Welcome to our channel History Chronicles. As the storm of revolution continued to sweep across France, a significant transformation was underway. By 1791, the country was on the brink of a historic change, the transition from an absolute monarchy to a constitutional one. This shift was not merely a political adjustment, but a profound reconfiguration of the nation's identity and governance. Imagine Paris in the summer of 1791. The city is a whirlwind of excitement and anxiety. The National Assembly, formed by the delegates of the Third Estate, has been working tirelessly to draft a new constitution that would redefine the relationship between the monarchy and the people. The air is thick with anticipation as the Assembly prepares to present its reforms. At the heart of this transformation is the new Constitution of 1791, a groundbreaking document that aims to establish a constitutional monarchy. This constitution represents a compromise between the revolutionary ideals of popular sovereignty and the desire to maintain some elements of the traditional monarchy. It is a bold attempt to balance the power of the king with the rights of the people. As the details of the constitution are debated and finalized, imagine the tension in the assembly. Members are divided over various issues, from the extent of the king's powers to the role of the newly created legislative assembly. The debates are fierce, reflecting the deep-seated conflicts and differing visions for France's future. The Constitution establishes the King of France as the head of state, but with significantly reduced powers. The king will now be bound by the laws created by the newly formed Legislative Assembly. This marks a dramatic departure from the previous system, where the king wielded almost absolute authority. The monarch's role is now more symbolic and ceremonial, with real political power resting in the hands of elected representatives. One of the most significant changes is the introduction of the Legislative Assembly, which replaces the Estates General. This new body is composed of representatives elected by the citizens, and it is tasked with making laws and overseeing the administration of the country. The aim is to create a more democratic and representative system of governance, where the people have a direct say in the laws that govern them. However, the transition to a constitutional monarchy is fraught with challenges. Many segments of French society are resistant to change, particularly those who fear losing their traditional privileges or power. The nobility and clergy, who have long enjoyed special status, are uneasy about the new order. At the same time, radical revolutionaries push for even greater changes, arguing that the new constitution does not go far enough in dismantling the old regime. The new constitution is put to the test almost immediately. The king's flight to Varennes in June 1791, an ill-fated attempt to escape Paris and rally support from royalist sympathizers, dramatically undermines the trust in his commitment to the new system. The king's attempted escape, combined with growing unrest and opposition, puts the fledgling constitutional monarchy under immense pressure. Despite these challenges, the Constitution of 1791 represents a crucial step in the evolution of the French Revolution. It embodies the revolutionary ideals of liberty and equality, while also seeking to preserve some aspects of the traditional monarchy. The Constitution is a reflection of the complex and often contradictory nature of the Revolution, a movement that seeks to forge a new path while grappling with the remnants of the old order. In our next episode, we will delve into the dramatic events surrounding King Louis XVI's flight to Varennes. We'll explore the implications of this ill-fated escape attempt and how it further complicated the political landscape of revolutionary France. Thank you for joining us in this episode of History Chronicles. Stay tuned as we continue to unravel the compelling story of the French Revolution. See you next time. Hello friends, welcome to our channel History Chronicles. The summer of 1789 was a time of profound change in France, with revolution stirring in the hearts of the people. In the cities, especially in Paris, the air was thick with anticipation as the National Assembly debated the future of the nation. But far from the bustling urban centers, in the quiet countryside, a different kind of unrest was taking root. This was not the intellectual fervor of political debate or the organized protests of the urban masses. It was something more primal, more visceral, a wave of panic and fear that would sweep through rural France and come to be known as the Great Fear. In the rural villages and towns of France, the common people, the peasants, had long endured the harsh realities of life under the Ancien regime. They were burdened by heavy taxes, subjected to feudal obligations, and often at the mercy of local lords who held significant power over their lives. While the revolution in Paris was unfolding, the peasants were beginning to hear rumors that would ignite a wildfire of fear and suspicion. The summer of 1789 was marked by a severe economic crisis that had left many peasants struggling to survive. The harvests had been poor, food was scarce, and prices were rising. As these hardships grew, so did the anger and frustration among the rural population. But what truly set the stage for the Great Fear were the whispers of conspiracy, of an impending counter-revolution led by the aristocracy. It was said that the nobles, threatened by the revolutionary changes in Paris, were plotting to suppress the uprising by force. They would, so the rumors went, unleash bands of brigands to pillage the countryside, destroy the harvest, and starve the people into submission. These rumors spread like wildfire. In village after village, fear took hold. The peasants, already on edge due to their dire circumstances, were quick to believe that an attack was imminent. The stories varied from place to place. Sometimes the brigands were said to be foreign mercenaries. Other times they were described as criminals released from the jails by the nobility. But the common thread in all these tales was the belief that the nobility was behind it all, seeking to reassert their control over the country. The Great Fear was not just a product of rumor. It was also fueled by a deep-seated mistrust of the aristocracy. For centuries, the peasants had lived under the thumb of the feudal lords, who extracted labor and taxes from them with little regard for their well-being. Now, with the revolution shaking the foundations of the old order, the peasants were ready to rise up against their oppressors. The fear of an attack by brigands became a catalyst for action. Across France, the response to the Great Fear was swift and, at times, violent. In many areas, the peasants took matters into their own hands. They formed militias, armed themselves with whatever weapons they could find, and began to patrol the countryside, looking for signs of the rumored brigands. But as the days passed and no such brigands appeared, the focus of their anger began to shift. If the nobles were behind the brigands, then perhaps it was the nobles themselves who needed to be dealt with. What followed was a wave of attacks on the symbols of feudal power. Peasants stormed the manor houses of the nobility, ransacking them and destroying records of feudal dues and obligations. These records, known as terriers, were a constant reminder of the peasants' subjugation, listing the taxes and services they were required to provide to their lords. By destroying these documents, the peasants were symbolically and literally freeing themselves from the bonds of feudalism. In some cases, the violence went further. There were reports of noblemen being attacked or even killed, though these incidents were relatively rare. For the most part, the Great Fear was marked by the destruction of property rather than the loss of life. Nevertheless, the message was clear. The old order was being swept away, and the peasants would no longer tolerate the injustices they had endured for so long. The National Assembly in Paris, alarmed by the spread of the Great Fear, recognized that it needed to address the grievances of the peasants before the situation spiraled out of control. On August 4th, 1789, in a dramatic session, the Assembly voted to abolish the feudal system entirely. The decrees of August 4th marked the end of feudal privileges, including the seigneurial rights of the nobility, the tithe owed to the church, and other forms of peasant obligations. It was a monumental shift, as centuries of tradition were swept away in a single night. The Great Fear, though rooted in rumor and paranoia, had a profound impact on the course of the French Revolution. It demonstrated the power of the peasantry and their willingness to take radical action to defend their rights. It also highlighted the deep divisions between the rural population and the aristocracy, divisions that would continue to shape the revolution in the years to come. But beyond the immediate consequences, the Great Fear revealed something deeper about the nature of the revolution. It showed that the revolution was not just a political movement led by the educated elite in Paris. It was also a social and economic upheaval that touched every corner of France. The peasants, who had long been the most oppressed and marginalized group in French society, were now asserting their place in the new order. As we reflect on the events of the Great Fear, it's important to recognize the complex emotions that drove the peasants to act as they did. They were motivated by fear, yes, but also by a desire for justice and a better life. The destruction of the manorial records was not just an act of vandalism. It was a declaration of freedom, a rejection of a system that had kept them in chains for generations. The Great Fear may have been born out of rumor and panic, but its legacy is one of empowerment. The peasants of France, once thought to be passive and submissive, had shown that they were capable of shaping their own destiny. They had taken the revolutionary ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity to heart, and they would fight to see them realized. Thank you for joining us on this journey through one of the most tumultuous periods of French history. The Great Fear was a moment of profound transformation, not just for the peasants who lived through it, but for the nation as a whole. As we continue to explore the events of the French Revolution, we'll see how this fear gave way to hope, and how the people of France worked to build a new society on the ashes of the old. Until next time, stay curious and keep exploring with History Chronicles. Hello friends, welcome to our channel History Chronicles. As we walk through the bustling streets of Paris in the summer of 1789, we can feel the air thick with anticipation and hope. The French Revolution is in full swing, and a new era seems to be dawning. Amidst the cries for liberty, equality, and fraternity, a group of determined revolutionaries is working tirelessly to craft a document that will forever change the course of history. This document, known as the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, will become one of the most influential statements of human rights ever written. The French Revolution had already brought about significant change. The Estates General had been convened, the National Assembly had been formed, and the storming of the Bastille had signaled the end of the old regime's unquestioned authority. But what was missing was a clear, guiding set of principles that could unite the people and serve as the foundation for a new society. The leaders of the revolution understood that to build a just and fair society, they needed to articulate the rights and freedoms that every citizen should enjoy, regardless of their birth or status. In the sweltering heat of August 1789, members of the National Assembly gathered to debate and draft what would become the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. The assembly was composed of men from various walks of life, lawyers, intellectuals, and even some nobles who had embraced the revolutionary cause. They were inspired by Enlightenment thinkers like Rousseau and Montesquieu, who had argued that governments existed to protect the natural rights of individuals. These rights, they believed, were universal and inherent to all human beings. The Declaration was intended to be more than just a legal document. It was a bold statement of the values that would underpin the new French Republic. The revolutionaries wanted to break away from the oppressive systems of the past and create a society where all men were free and equal. The Declaration would serve as a blueprint for this new society, outlining the fundamental rights that every citizen should have and the duties of the government to protect those rights. On August 26, 1789, after days of passionate debate and discussion, the National Assembly adopted the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. The Declaration consisted of 17 articles, each one carefully crafted to express the core principles of the revolution. The first article declared that men are born and remain free and equal in rights. This was a radical departure from the old regime, where a person's rights and status were determined by their birth. The second article emphasized that the aim of all political association is the preservation of the natural and imprescriptible rights of man. These rights were defined as liberty, property, security, and resistance to oppression. This was a clear rejection of the feudal privileges that had long dominated French society. The revolutionaries were making it clear that in the new France, everyone would have the right to own property, live in safety, and be free from tyranny. One of the most significant aspects of the Declaration was its emphasis on the rule of law. Article 6 stated that the law is the expression of the general will, and that every citizen has the right to participate in the creation of the law. This was a direct challenge to the absolute monarchy, where laws were made by the king without any input from the people. The revolutionaries were asserting that in a just society, laws should be made by the people, for the people. The Declaration also enshrined the principle of popular sovereignty, stating that the source of all sovereignty resides essentially in the nation. This meant that the ultimate authority in France would no longer rest with the king or the nobility, but with the people themselves. This idea was revolutionary in every sense of the word, as it completely overturned the traditional hierarchy that had governed France for centuries. The Declaration was not without its critics. Some argued that it did not go far enough in addressing the rights of women, slaves, and other marginalized groups. In fact, the document was primarily focused on the rights of men, and its language reflected the patriarchal attitudes of the time. Women like Olympe de Gouges, who would later write the Declaration of the Rights of Woman and the Female Citizen, were vocal in their criticism of the Declaration's exclusion of women from the rights it guaranteed. Despite these criticisms, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen was a landmark achievement. It provided a clear and concise statement of the values that the revolutionaries were fighting for, and it served as a powerful symbol of their commitment to creating a more just and equal society. The Declaration was not just a product of its time, it was a document that would resonate far beyond the borders of France. The impact of the Declaration was felt across Europe and beyond. It inspired other revolutionary movements and became a reference point for the drafting of constitutions in various countries. The Declaration's influence can be seen in documents like the United States Bill of Rights and the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Its principles of equality, liberty, and popular sovereignty would go on to shape the political landscape of the modern world. But while the Declaration was a statement of high ideals, the reality of the French Revolution was far more complex. As the revolution progressed, the ideals of the Declaration were often compromised by the harsh realities of political power. The Reign of Terror, which would follow a few years later, saw the suspension of many of the rights guaranteed by the Declaration as the revolutionary government struggled to maintain control in the face of internal and external threats. Even so, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen remains one of the most important documents in the history of human rights. It was a bold assertion that all men are created equal and that governments exist to serve the people, not the other way around. It was a declaration of hope for a better world where everyone could live in freedom and dignity. As we conclude this episode, let's remember that the struggle for human rights is an ongoing one. The ideals of the Declaration continue to inspire people around the world to fight for justice, equality, and freedom. And while the road to achieving these ideals may be long and difficult, the Declaration reminds us that a better world is possible. Thank you for joining us on this journey through history. Until next time, stay curious and keep exploring with History Chronicles. Hello, friends. Welcome to our channel, History Chronicles. In the spring of 1791, as France grappled with revolutionary change, a dramatic and fateful episode unfolded, the flight to Varennes. This event, marked by King Louis XVI's attempt to escape Paris, would have profound repercussions for the course of the revolution and the future of the French monarchy. Picture Paris in late June 1791. The city is abuzz with the latest news and political intrigue. The revolutionary changes have put immense pressure on the monarchy, and tensions are running high. King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette are increasingly isolated, their authority diminished by the new constitutional framework and growing public discontent. Louis XVI, feeling cornered and desperate, hatches a plan to escape Paris and seek refuge in the royalist stronghold of Varennes, a small town near the border with the Austrian Netherlands. The plan is to rally support from sympathetic nobles and foreign powers, hoping to restore the old regime and undermine the revolutionary government. Imagine the secret preparations for this escape. The king and queen, along with their immediate family and a small entourage, prepare to leave the city under cover of darkness. They are disguised in common clothes and travel in a convoy of carriages, hoping to evade detection. The stakes are incredibly high, and the risk of failure is immense. As the royal family sets out, the journey is fraught with complications. The group moves slowly and cautiously, trying to avoid drawing attention. They make stops along the way, often facing delays and difficulties that threaten to derail their escape. Despite the careful planning, the tension and uncertainty of the journey are palpable. However, fate is not on their side. On the night of June 20th, as they approach the town of Varennes, their plans begin to unravel. The royal family's carriage is recognized by a local postmaster, who quickly alerts the authorities. News of the king's flight spreads rapidly, and the revolutionary government scrambles to respond. The capture of Louis XVI and his family becomes a matter of urgency. Local revolutionary forces intercept the fleeing royals and arrest them in Varennes. The once great escape plan collapses in dramatic fashion, and the royal family is brought back to Paris under heavy guard. Their failed attempt to escape marks a turning point in the revolution. The implications of the flight to Varennes are profound. The king's attempted escape is seen as an act of betrayal by many revolutionaries. It confirms their suspicions that Louis XVI is not committed to the constitutional monarchy and that he seeks to undermine the revolution. The failed escape attempt erodes what little trust remained between the monarchy and the revolutionary government. In Paris, the reaction to the king's flight is a mix of outrage and disillusionment. The royal family's failure to escape and their subsequent return to the capital intensify calls for more radical measures. The revolutionaries see this as evidence of the need for a more decisive break from the old regime. The failure of the flight accelerates the push towards a republic and increases support for more extreme revolutionary factions. The flight to Varennes marks a critical juncture in the French Revolution. It underscores the deepening rift between the monarchy and the revolutionary forces, setting the stage for further conflict and upheaval. The event reveals the fragility of the constitutional monarchy and the growing radicalization of revolutionary politics. In our next episode, we will examine the Champ de Mars massacre, a tragic and violent confrontation that further fueled the revolutionary fervor and highlighted the deepening divisions within French society. Thank you for joining us in this episode of History Chronicles. Stay tuned as we continue to explore the dramatic and transformative events of the French Revolution. See you next time.